So, John, tell me about your experience with the PSP.
So I really wanted a PSP back in 2005. I was looking at all these magazines, I saw some Japanese imports in my local used game store, and it just seemed like the coolest thing in the world. And at that time, I was coming off the PS2, because I was kind of a PS2 and PS1 kid before Nintendo, so the fact that they were doing a handheld just got me really, really excited. And so, for Christmas in 2005, I got a PSP with a copy of Ridge Racer. And I'm not a racing game guy, but just the visuals were mind-blowing to me. And I remember on Christmas Day, my uncle came over, and he doesn't care about games at all. And I just kind of try and put the PSP in his face, kind of, just to make sure that he would see the graphics. And he didn't care. But I was like, look at the visuals, look at the cars, they're so shiny. But this was like a multimedia machine, though, so it was so exciting. In the era before smartphones, to have something that can listen to music, and play movies, and play 3D games, I was all in from the first year.
Yeah, I had that same feeling about it. I never owned a PSP as a child. I only had I was one of the Nintendo creeps where I just always had like the GBA, GBA, and then moved on to the DS, of course. But just moving from GBA to DS was this monumental feeling, mainly because of Mario 64 DS, of seeing a 3D game in the palm of my hands. And I just kind of felt like getting anything that was of a console quality in the palm of your hands was mind-blowing at the time. I'm sure if I would have seen an N-Gage, I would have just shit my pants with just like how crazy. It's just like you had Tomb Raider PS1 basically on there. You had Call of Duty, you had an Elder Scrolls game, you had all of this stuff where it's just like 3D visuals. Even if it was compromised, it was still really, really impressive. And just seeing like a console game that is only really known for being a console game like Mario 64 on the DS was mind-blowing. But I only really like saw the PSP via commercials and just heard how it was literally a PS2 in your pocket pretty much. And that blew my mind. And especially the fact that you could play movies on it. And I think it was more impressive that the movies were physical media, if anything, because it made it feel like it was like, wow, like this is a DVD player truly to go. Because I went through my fair share of like the laptop style portable DVD players, and those were awesome back in the day. But they were still like you could understand how they worked. It was basically like, okay, tiny DVD player with a screen attached, and that's it. The PSP was basically the size of an iPod, and it had like a disc. It had a disc slot, which was crazy. I think it was just, I think the hype alone about just a console in your pocket carried the PSP so far, because I think a lot of people kind of underestimate how well the PSP did nowadays, because it sold over 80 million units, and I've tried to kind of analyze, I've tried to create a thesis statement about why the PSP isn't as remembered like fondly as even something like the GBA, because it sold comparable amounts of units. I personally feel like it's because like it never really had like a lot of like super. I mean, why do you think? I don't want to sound like an idiot first.
No, sure.
Why do you think the PSP?
I mean, the best-selling game for PSP is Liberty City Stories, and I think that sold like 8 million or something along those lines, which isn't much. I mean, it's good numbers, but for the best-selling game on the console, that's not that much. Whereas DS had multiple 10+ million sellers. There were 30 million sellers on that console. So obviously software wasn't spanning as far of a net. But PSP did have some really far-reaching genres and franchises, though. I mean, Monster Hunter started on the PS2, but really, it started on the PSP. That's where it found its footing. That's where it grew in Japan and became what it is today. And there were so many franchises that did reach Japan and made it a popular system there. And it's just as a multimedia device, like we're touching on UMDs. They sound silly today. Like if you think of like GBA full motion video cartridges, like they sound silly. But the memory stick duos, the memory sticks you put in the PSP, they couldn't hold that much, and they were expensive at launch. So getting those UMDs made a lot of sense. And I got this Pirates of the Caribbean double pack that Dead Man's Chest the game with Curse of the Black Pearl and UMD. So that was like they kind of like shoved them together sometimes. So that was neat. But yeah, I think the reason was probably it just didn't have Nintendo games. I mean, Nintendo's got Nintendogs, it's got Mario, it's got Zelda, whereas the PSP, I suppose it just didn't have that kind of reach in its software.
Whenever Sony would try to do something like that, there was always this lingering feeling of being pathetic whenever they would try to go after Nintendo. Like I'm looking at the PSP right now, and like the closest to like anything that really feels like Nintendo would feel kind of like in Invisimals or something along those lines. They had iPet and all of that. And those were fine games in their own right, but it was very obvious that Sony kind of tried to take the PSP and kind of turn it into like an everyman's machine. And just the fact that they were kind of doing a bit more casual stuff, and they did that with the Vita as well. They had kind of a Brain Age-esque game on there, and they had PlayStation Vita Pets and all of that. So like they did try to go after that more casual crowd. But I don't know. I feel like the PSP isn't as isn't as like looked upon fondly as something like the DS or GBA, just because, well, one, I think I'm mostly in more of a Nintendo heavy like whatever circle of people that are like, oh, I remember this, I didn't care about the PSP. But I had a friend that owned a PSP, and I asked him, I was just like, what is your history with this thing? And he said like, well, I got it for Christmas, I played Lego Batman on it, and that was about it. And I think the hype of having a console in your pocket really carried it. Monster Hunter Japan helped out, and you did have a lot of really solid just like franchises as a part of it. I mean, just the fact, like this would never happen today. You had 2 exclusive Grand Theft Autos, at least exclusive for the time. They eventually came to PS2, but that's crazy. That's crazy. That's like how I don't know how they could pull that off, where it's just like not only do you get a Grand Theft Auto game, a full 3D Grand Theft Auto game in your pocket, but it's also exclusive. That is mind-blowing to me.
It's nuts.
Yeah.
And there were some games that were literally multi-plat with PS2. Like Crash Tag Team Racing was one of them. That came out multi-platform with PS2 and PSP. And you can transfer your save back and forth between the consoles. That kind of thing was just showing how powerful this is. But I think, in a comparison to Nintendo, they usually get the big boys, like EAD or EPD or anyone who generally just makes the high-quality Nintendo games. They were making both DS games and Wii games and GameCube games. They weren't compromising. So where Nintendo were getting their big teams on New Super Mario Bros., Sony, they were doing things like Daxter, which is clearly a spin-off. Like, Jak and Daxter did hit the PSP, it wasn't by Naughty Dog. Like, they were getting other studios to make their big franchises, and doing more spin-offs than mainline entries. I think that's the big problem. When you think about PSP in the depths of the library, you're usually talking about third-party stuff. Like, Metal Gear Solid Peace Walker is mind-blowing for a portable game. That's basically Metal Gear Solid 5. And things like Castlevania as well, there was some great stuff on PSP, but again, that was Konami. Sony just weren't really doing the heavy lifting on either PSP or the Vita.
Yeah, I think that's one of the big issues, where it's just like either way it felt a little inadequate. I mean the fact that you had an analog nub was fantastic. But it was one of those things where just like, man, if you're going that far, you might as well include another one, because I think camera control was a big thing with PSP, where it's just like a lot of those PS2 ports, no matter what, even if they were like picture perfect, which they generally weren't, but I mean the camera control was compromised. It was something where you either had to use like the L and R buttons or some weird thing where you had to hold L and move the analog stick around. It always felt like there was something holding it back. And just the fact that it was using optical media and it was spinning all the time kind of made it not as portable friendly. I mean, it was still fine, like on road trips and whatnot, but it just, the fact that it didn't have a clamshell design like the DS and all of that at the time when that was really popular, I feel like that just kind of made it not as portable friendly as the DS. And in addition, a lot of the games were PS2 quality, which was awesome, but that made the DS a bit better at like just handheld stuff in general, where it's just like pop it open, play it, close it. Whereas the PSP was more like you can play this full game on the go, but it's a little bit compromised. You might want to just play it at home, hooked up to your TV, but at that point, it's just like You still have kind of the botched camera control and whatnot, but either way, it was still really impressive. Though I always did look at the PSP, like whenever Sony would do handheld games, and I think this was an issue with the Vita as well, is just the fact that they would always get the B team. And it would feel like, okay, this is getting to console quality. It looks like console quality in a trailer. Like if you watch a trailer for like Uncharted Golden Abyss, they're playing that game at like 4K or something, and they're like, this is what you're gonna get. And then when you play it on the screen, it still looks good, but you know, it's still a little pixelated, and you can see like JPEGs for the background a lot of the time and whatnot. You can see like where they cut the corners to get this on the Vita perfectly. But it still felt like, you know, when they would do spin-offs for the PSP, when they would do PSP versions of franchises, it always kind of felt like this was, it's like, oh, we're not gonna, we don't believe in this platform enough to do a true sequel or have the developers truly make a game for it. Like, I have Killzone Liberation here, and I was expecting this to be like a first-person shooter, and no, it's a top-down running gun or and whatnot, and it's just like, wow, like, I just feel like at the time, like, playing this at the time, it would be like, what is this? Like, you know, I was promised console quality ports and games and all of that, and you get something that you would have gotten on the DS as like a console, a handheld iteration of a console game. But that's not to undermine a lot. I think Sony's own games on it were good. They were pretty good, but I feel like they kind of undermined what the PSP was as a platform, because it kind of just made it seem like it was kind of just that, you know, like just an awkward cousin kind of thing, where they were just like, we're just going to give you side games, spin-offs and whatnot. But I think the third parties really picked up the slack. Like, I'm looking, and even if like these ports weren't like, oh, this is like the exact console quality game, it's still impressive. Like, I didn't even know until recently that Dante's Inferno came out on this thing, which is weird. That's weird to me.
Yeah. Capcom did a bunch of things as well. There's like, there are the two Mega Man remakes. There's Powered Up and Maverick Hunter X, which are like round-up 2.5D remakes of the first Mega Man and Mega Man X. And they've never been re-released.
Yeah, it feels like an odd platform to do that on, but
it does.
But it's still really cool. And they also did Ghosts and Goblins Resurrection.
Yeah,
Ultimate. Yeah, that's the Switch version. Again, like, I'm gonna look like a moron, absolute moron. No,
Sega also did Crazy Taxi Fair Wars, which is a compilation of 1 and 2. And they don't run the best, but just having that game on a handheld at the time, that felt really, really good.
Well, you even had Power Stone, yeah.
Sega did that.
I was going to say, Power Stone as well. I'm looking over here. Tekken 6 came to the PSP. You had Tekken 6.
Oh, yeah.
You had
Tekken Dark Resurrection. That might have a different name in the States, but Dark Resurrection was one of my first like proper Tekkens. I dabbled at a friend's house, but that was when I really got into Tekken. And there was quite a few fighters on the PSP, so you could definitely like get your proper console feel on that thing.
Yeah, I mean, and I think what's kind of just alluring me to the PSP a bit more is just how strange it is with a lot of these games. Just the fact that like the only Sonic games that ever released on the PSP were the Sonic Rivals series. Not only did they do one, it was the only Sonic game that released on the PSP, and they did 2 of them. Which implies that the first one did well enough, which would make you think like they would do something like, I don't know, like do anything other than Sonic Rivals, but there's Sonic Rivals, which is just really bizarre. And I don't know, but like Sony did try with the PSP, I felt. You know, you got stuff like Mod Nation Racers. I'm looking over my stack of games. You got Jak and Daxter, the Lost Frontier, which was supposed to be the 4th game. That is officially Jak 4, but nobody talks about it.
No one calls it. No one calls it that, do they?
I think on the back of the box.
It was also on PS2, I think.
Yeah. I bought the PS2 version, so I do have that. But they did that after Daxter. But it even felt like it's just like you said, just those side games like Daxter and Secret Agent Clank and everything like that. It's just a lot of weird stuff that it's just kind of like, again, like it's something where this does feel like a console quality game, but just the fact that you're kind of relegating this to side character stuff. I can definitely see why it doesn't feel like as big of a deal as it does. But I always looked at the PSP with a bit of envy. I always thought like this is an insanely cool platform, but I chose the DS. I mainly because like it was cheaper and it just had more hip games at the time, because frankly at the time I didn't really know what would be like my go-to, like, oh, this is what I want on the PSP. But I think, when did you get onto the DS train? When were you like, all right, I admit defeat, I'm gonna try the DS?
I was always tempted by Mario 64 DS. So just seeing that thing running on the system, it was like it made me feel like I was sort of undermining what DS was capable of. But then a lot of the follow-up games just didn't match that, and I think there's a big reason for that. We're kind of saying how PSP didn't have dual analog sticks, and that limited it in a lot of ways. DS didn't have any analog sticks, and that hindered games like Mario 64 DS and Rayman DS. And I think after that, a lot of studios just stopped trying to do big 3D games, and instead focused on the limitations of what DS could do. So I was still on the PSP side for a while, just because of how powerful it was, and I was like an early teen or kid, I guess, at that time. So I was just all in on the power. But then Zelda came along, and I was getting super into Zelda at that time. I'd bought a cheap N64 with Ocarina of Time, I got a Wii and played through all the Virtual Console games, and I was like, man, Phantom Hourglass? This is gonna change the world. So I had to get a DS of Phantom Hourglass.
Did it?
And I enjoyed it.
Change the world?
I don't know if it changed the world. That puzzle where you close the DS may have changed the world.
I wasn't paying attention to Phantom Hourglass when it came out, so it may have very well changed the world, and I just didn't I just wasn't paying attention.
Just didn't notice.
I think. I think it comes down to. When do you think the PSP really kind of started to like be? Because I remember reading that Sony generally considered the PSP to do okay, because Sony always wants to go big with their consoles. Most of their consoles have sold over 100 million units, or at least half of them. They're like, if anything sells below that, they're like, well, we'll do better next time. And it's just like the PS3 sold 80 million units, 87 something million units. The PSP sold over 80 million units. The Vita is kind of the only major outlier.
They don't say what it sold. If you go on their official sales stats, there's like an asterisk at the bottom that say like, we are not listing PlayStation Vita.
It's the same with like Xbox
How bad
One.
did it do?
It's the same with Xbox One. You can say anything you want about Nintendo. They are very upfront with the Wii U. They're just like every single time they talk about the Switch sales, right alongside it is how much the Wii U sold on their financial report website. Of course, it's like pretty much all of their consoles of the past like 15 plus years, but still. But what I was saying was like, when do you think the PSP started to kind of like fall out of fashion, would you say? And did you ever upgrade or downgrade, if you will, to the other revisions of the system? And how do those compare to like the revisions of the DS, would you say? Like who revised their system the best overall?
All right. So I think it probably started to lose steam when the iPhone came along. Because PSP 2004 in Japan, 2005 here. The iPhone, I want to say 2007. Was that when it first came out?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's got a 2-year head lead on being a multimedia device that can play movies and look at photos and play music and play games. So that's good for the first 2 years, but then phones start doing the exact same thing. I think people start saying to themselves, like, why do I need a PSP for this when my phone does everything and I can take it everywhere? So that's probably where it starts to lose momentum. But Monster Hunter probably brings it back up. And then Peace Walker, I think, gave it a nice boost as well, but that's probably finding a smaller niche within there, though. As for revisions, I revised once. I got the PSP 2000, and that had the video out, so that was a big deal. You can record PSP footage with that. And they also had the PSP 3000 and the PSP Go. With 1000, 2000, and 3000, you are looking at very minute differences. I think if you're not looking at video out, most people probably couldn't tell you the difference. They're a bit slimmer, they feel different, and I quite like the metallic-y feel to the original one. It's very hard, like heavy, it feels very solid, whereas they start to feel a little bit weaker as it goes on, I feel. A friend of mine had 3000, and I think there was even like a 3001, if I remember correctly. that had like no Wi-Fi.
Yeah, I do remember the model number. There was at least like 1001. I think like the no Wi-Fi model was like the PSP like Street or something like that.
That was it. Yeah, PSP Street.
Something like that. Yeah. And it had like a weirder matte finish, and they released it around like 2013, and it was only around Europe, I think. But yeah, that one didn't have Wi-Fi or a microphone, I think. So they were scrapping anything possible. I find it weird that they were like out of all the things to scrap, they were like Wi-Fi and the microphone. It's just like I'm just like, one of these things is a little more important, but I digress.
DS though, like the revisions for DS were major, because the original DS Fat was not the most attractive machine in the world. Whereas the PSP, I feel like if you look at all the models, they're pretty much the same. They look pretty much the same. Whereas DS to DS Lite is a massive jump. That made DS sexy. Yeah. PSP was always sexy.
I think that was one of the main reasons why it sold so many units, is because people had incentive to upgrade. Because I went from DS Lite to DSi. Did I really have much of a reason? I mean, kinda, but it's also like, yeah, you could have managed. If anything, there was reason to have a DS Lite and DSi. Both at the same time. Whereas PSP, I felt like even if you still had the 1000, you could still truck through the generation with that, even though 2000 was definitely a good step up. But yeah, I do feel like DS probably wins on the revision war, and I think that did kind of help it sell at least a good handful of more units than the PSP. I'd say, I don't know. I don't want to make any statements here. I don't want to make any assumptions on how many people upgraded from the DS Lite to DSi. But yeah, like they did so many revisions, and I felt like even something like the DSi XL was noteworthy. There was reason for that to exist. Where PSP just kind of felt like kind of like small little incremental things.
There's different audiences. Like my grandmother got a DSi XL. She played Professor Layton. There was some book collections that she got on the DS. So like PSP 1000, 2000, 3000, you're selling it to people who want a PSP. DSi XL, like those are totally different people. And the DS just kind of ran with that for most of its library. Like Brain Training, Nintendogs, Mario, Zelda, Metroid, they're all different people. And they're somehow pulling them all in. So it's no question why the DS did better, especially because it's cheaper too. Like you can go to a shop and just bring back a DS and a game for way less than what a PSP costs.
I know we didn't really talk about the Go during the revision section. Can we talk about the PSP Go? I want to talk about the PSP Go.
We can.
It was
Let's talk about the PSP
Go. I mean, overall, if that released today, I think it would be a far bigger success. Similar to like the Vita, I think. Like I don't think it far bigger, but like something where it's just like I think it would do better if it released today.
It was ahead of its time in many ways.
I think just the fact that in like 2009 you're gonna do a digital only console. Gotta be honest, that was pretty ballsy. I will give Sony that. They were it was something where it's just like, wow. Well, with internet speeds the way they are, good luck on that. 16 gigabytes of onboard memory. That's pretty good for the time, I guess. But still, like it's just like with games as big as like PSP games, which they definitely not as big as games these days. But it's still like you're probably gonna fill it up. But I commend the idea at the time because UMD was kind of, it felt like a bit of an outdated format even when it came out because you did have a lot of limitations with it, and it was obvious that just doing kind of game card style things was the way to go. It made the PSP harder to manufacture and harder to fix, all of that. There's moving parts in a portable machine, which I just feel like is a little like, a pocketable kind of machine. I feel like that's just kind of asking for trouble in some cases. I think they wanted to get away from that, so I think it was a sound idea to do a digital-only machine, but it was too expensive, and it just, I think most people could just see, like this is not worth it. If you want to go all digital, just buy a regular PSP and just go all digital with that.
Yeah, there's a big problem there too, is that the PSP didn't get its digital store, as in being able to buy physical games on the store. That didn't come along until after launch, so there's some big games that just aren't available digitally. And one of the biggest ones is Final Fantasy VII Crisis Core. That was one of the killer apps for PSP, and it's not on the store. So if you've got a PSP Go, you can't play that game.
I think I can commend the idea at the time, because it didn't feel like, because I feel like something like a PS5 digital edition or an Xbox Series S, those are manufactured to, like, they want to go in that direction. They want to be like, let us do all digital because we make the most money, we have the most control, all of that. I mean, like, that's probably what they were thinking with the PSP Go, but I personally didn't view it as that. I viewed it more as, like, they were like, let's get the hell away from this UMD thing, and let's try something different, let's try something new. And I can commend them doing that. I thought the design, while I didn't find it that comfortable with the analog stick to, like, the side, I thought it was a neat kind of design. I thought it was like, this is kind of cool. And they reused that design with the Xperia Play phone, which, there were all these rumors going around. It was always like, people were like, Nintendo should make a phone, and then they were like, oh, Sony's making a PSP phone. They were thinking like the next PSP was going to be a flat-out phone. But yeah, so overall, but the PSP did have a very long life overall. Like, it was still getting games after the Vita released, but these days, how would you rank, like, how would you I don't know, what would you say comes out on top for you, the DS or the PSP?
It's undoubtedly the DS. Like, the DS has some of the most interesting games, like, of all time. Like, Ghost Trick is so phenomenal. And the PSP has a good library when you dive deep, but I think just looking at the face of it, it's weaker. It doesn't cover as many corners, it's just... A lot of the games feel like they're of their era, whereas the DS is kind of this little bubble where many games haven't aged that much, or at least some of the big ones haven't aged that much. So yeah, DS is absolutely one of that comes out on top today. But at the time, like, PSP was just so ahead of its time, and I loved that you could download PS1 games as well. Like, you can play like Crash Bandicoot on that thing, which Nintendo were doing with the Wii. But I thought, when DSi came along, I thought, of course, they're going to put Game Boy games on DSi.
They removed the GBA slot, and it's just like, I would think it would make perfect sense. That would make the most sense in the world to be like, hey, we removed the GBA slot, but you can rebuy the games via DSi shop, and they would have made so much money off of that. They even did the thing where the DSi shop channel, or just the DSi shop, I don't think they were called channels on the DSi, but during the little download screen, on the Wii they had the 8-bit Mario. On the DSi they had Super Mario Advance models, which I thought was an even bigger slap in the face. I was literally going, it's just like, yeah, we're gonna reference this game that we gave you the inability to play with the DSi. I feel like, yeah.
But PSP, on the other hand, has no little models. It's just a little circle that goes round and round. Where's Daxter? Why doesn't Daxter bring stuff?
Yeah, that's the thing. They need to bring back Daxter. They should have made a Daxter 5 by now. I think, but overall, I will say, the crossbar on PSP, what's it, Cross XMB? What's the official term?
I think that's the official term for it.
I'm gonna want to look it up because I don't want to look like a jackass.
Fact check this. Yeah, PSP fans be furious.
Cross media bar. Never mind. The cross media bar.
Okay.
Okay, that's why it's called XMB, because it's XROSS.
That makes sense.
It's that. But yeah, that was something that I think helped it even feel more like a PS3. And while I think it's not intuitive for casual players, like the casual consumers, I think it's incredible. Like it's one of the best user interfaces of all time for like somebody that's in the know. That's somebody that's like more of like a full-on like, hey, this is my, I don't need like to be have my handheld or anything like that. Not to say it's like that convoluted, but I feel like I couldn't hand that to my mom and she would understand what to do. But yeah. I think that was an incredibly powerful user interface. Totally. Even using it today on like the PS3, I'm just like, wow, this is just like it's just easy to find things. Just with the fact that like. It's easy to find things. I'd say it's easy to understand and use, but then to find things. I mean, they list damn everything on the PS3. Like, it's literally go to the settings section, and it's like 10 pages long that you scroll up and down. But yeah, I thought I think it's a very cool and smart user interface, and just the fact that the PSP had it's kind of like how the DSi had a lot of elements of the Wii menu with its user interface, where it felt like, oh man, this is coming in. But do you think these handhelds benefited from having more console quality elements to them, or do you think that they were better off when they did their own thing? Like when they were just weird and handheld oriented kind of thing.
It's hard to answer, because I feel like the PSP thrived doing what the DS didn't do. Because the DS was clearly more successful. There's clearly more games. There's clearly probably better games overall. But I feel like this was a time where we had competition in a really healthy way. Like right now, the Switch just dominates the handheld space. Like we have Steam Deck coming up, but Steam Deck's just a portable PC. It's not doing anything different per se. Whereas PSP and DS had such different libraries, and I kind of like that the PSP chased that more console-orientated way of doing things. But games were still specifically designed for handheld play though. So like God of War wouldn't go on for like long stretches like it does in PS2, and I admired that stuff. I just kind of missed that era. I wish Sony would do another handheld, and I know why they're not doing it, but it just feels like everyone wins when they're just like putting out all these different games and different systems. Because apart from the Switch, everything is the same right now. Like PS5 and Series X, they are basically the same box. Yeah, for
sure. I think Sony has potential to kind of come back into the handheld space eventually, but I don't think they're going to do it. I think they would have to do something. If they're going to do a new handheld, I think it's going to be very Switch-esque potentially. I don't know. But I don't think they're really going to do that. I think potentially they may look at something like when the hardware gets good enough, they might try to do kind of like a PS4 to go kind of thing. I'm just rambling. I doubt that's actually going to happen. But if it's going to happen, they might do that. But I think I have my thesis statement for why the Vita may do well today, okay. better today. So let me know if this is a sound argument. I feel like in 2012.
All right.
That was when you remember like in 2012, like there were all these articles basically saying consoles are dying and mobile gaming is going to take over. Yeah, it was all about consoles dying.
Yeah.
And the 3DS did okay, but it's still the least popular Nintendo handheld. That's like an actual mainline system. And I feel like at that time, and I do feel like consumers were that was when smartphones were becoming widely adopted. Everybody was getting a smartphone. Like everybody, I was in high school at the time, and everybody had a smartphone back then. And nobody was bringing their 3DS or Vita or anything like that to school. In fact, if you saw anybody with a DS, you were like, whoa, silly. But I think everybody would just play on their smartphones, and it would be kind of like, oh, what's the mobile game this week? And it would be some garbage that was just like, oh, that was like when Flappy Bird was big and all of that. Like, oh, what's everybody playing now? And it would literally just be like everybody just plays their smartphone. And since smartphones were becoming widely adopted then, that was when smartphones were becoming a little more affordable, as in like everybody was like, okay, yeah, we got to get you that. This is kind of required now to own a smartphone. And I think everybody owning a smartphone potentially kind of made everybody feel like they didn't want to own anything that the smartphone already did. I feel like there was kind of this feeling of you don't need an iPod anymore, you have an iPhone. You don't need a handheld game player because I have all the games I need on my smartphone. You don't need this or that because the smartphone does it already. And then around the time of 2017 when the Switch came out, I feel like people kind of said I missed things, and they were just like, hey, sometimes just because a smartphone can do something doesn't mean I don't need or want a product that a smartphone can do a similar thing to. Whereas the Switch came out, and I think that showed people wow, this is cool and I want this. Polaroid cameras are back in fashion. Those are popular. And just all these little knickknacks and stuff. Vinyl records are way bigger now. Just the fact that people are I want to own things. I want to have physical objects, and maybe not because I need them. Maybe not because your phone can do all of that. Your phone can play these console quality looking games. Your phone can take pictures. Your phone can play music. But I feel like people are a little more open to doing a bit more just like the buying products that are a little more like, I can already do this on my phone, but this does it a little better, and this is also more fun. So I feel like the Vita, if it came out today, I don't think it would do crazy numbers, but I think it would do better than it did back then. That's my thesis statement. Let me know if it's dumb as hell.
That makes so much sense, actually. We hear often as well, like, smartphones, many new ones, are more powerful than the Switch. Because of course they are. They're new tech. They're way more expensive than the Switch. And I don't feel like we look at those and say, well, this is worthless now. Because the Switch just has this such broad and established library, but more than that is Nintendo games. We're not going to find 3D World plus Bowser's Fury on a phone. I think today there is a general knowledge for the difference between smartphone games and console games. Whereas back in 2012, it was like, it's just this or that rather than this and that. And like even like with in the casual market, like with Animal Crossing, with Clubhouse Games, with the upcoming Switch Sports, I think everyone's in that mindset now. It's not just the core demographic; it's literally everyone who would want to buy a Switch is kind of in that mindset now. So your thesis definitely makes sense.
I already messed up the cross media bar name. I didn't want to look like a complete buffoon. But yeah, I do think Sony would probably do a little better today in the handheld market if they did something very similar. Even if they just did the exact same thing. The Vita was the exact same, because the Vita still holds up. And I think the Vita was I think like all of PSP's shortcomings were addressed with the Vita, but the Vita just didn't do well. And do you think that was because, like I said, at that time, I think a lot of more mainstream consumers were kind of going, we're kind of moving away from dedicated handheld gaming, or do you think that's just because and do you think at the time it was because PSP was released at a time where people were like, oh hell yeah, let's do this, like I said, it was kind of a lot of the hype. I mean, do you think, they addressed pretty much all of the shortcomings with Vita with, the second analog stick and just a touchscreen and cameras and all of that, they added pretty much everything that they needed to add accessories for, or stuff that the DS or 3DS had. I don't know, do you think they should have done more? What do you think were, the PSP shortcomings that Sony didn't address, or, should have been addressed?
It all just kind of comes back to software, really. With the Vita, I think not only were the consumers in the mobile mind space, but so were developers. Capcom did stuff on the Vita. They had ports of Street Fighter Cross Tekken and Marvel vs. Capcom 3, yeah. But they weren't doing... Revelations 2 was on Vita, but they weren't doing Monster Hunter. They weren't doing unique Resident Evils. They weren't doing Mega Mans. And that was just kind of... There was that period of early 2010s where Capcom kind of went missing if it wasn't Resident Evil or re-releases of Street Fighter 4. And we saw that resurgence come along in the PS4 generation. But in that time, I think Capcom, Konami, all the pillars of the PSP weren't there anymore for Vita. And I know people always sort of pin the blame on Sony, but I think Sony pretty much did the same thing they did with the PSP with the Vita in terms of what they output. They had Killzone. They had, I think, was there a Resistance on Vita, or am I making that up?
Oh yeah, I recently played Resistance: Burning Skies.
That was it.
I've been going through a lot of the Vita library. I played an hour or two of Resistance: Burning Skies, and that was done by the same developer as Call of Duty Black Ops Declassified, which is considered one of the worst games of all time. So it was. They also did something else. They did PlayStation Move Heroes. That's it. This developer did it all. This developer did it all around that exact time. So they were doing a lot. But I 100% agree with you. It comes down to software, because Sony tried, but I think they need to try in different ways, or the effort was there. That first year of PS Vita, or at least that first day of PS Vita, was unprecedented. That has one of the best launch lineups I've ever seen. Just the fact that you had Uncharted, Wipeout, Hot Shots, or Everybody's Golf. I'm sorry.
Gravity Rush.
Yeah, Gravity Rush. Yeah, Gravity Rush was a couple months later or something.
I think it might be a launch in Japan, maybe, but...
Yeah, that would make sense. But at the very least, localized, it came out a couple months later. But and then like you had Unit 13, which I know nothing about. I just know that came out a couple months later. Mod Nation Racers, and then on the third party side, you had Ultimate MVC 3, Rayman Origins, all of this stuff where it's just like there was a ton of stuff on the Vita, but it was just it was mostly just stuff that I think outside of like Gravity Rush. It was mostly just stuff that was just kind of like a lesser version of a PS3 game. And it was very similar to how Sony treated the PSP, where it was a lesser version of, a PS2 game, where on the DS, like you were saying, Nintendo kind of committed it entirely to the DS. When a Zelda game came out on the DS, it wasn't like, oh, this is kind of the B team. Even if it was, they never told you that. They never were like, yeah, these are kind of like, who cares about these developers? This is the real thing. No, like it's, like Phantom Hourglass was just the next Zelda title, and it was always different, but Nintendo's always done that. They were never like, they always kind of had it, so then the handheld games always felt distinct from the console ones, where you were getting something different, but it was still the Zelda game. Or you had, like, that just the next lineup, the next entry in that franchise, where you had, Mario Kart DS was the follow-up to Double Dash in every way, outside of, like, visuals and presentation, where you had, like, it had double the amount of tracks, you had Wi-Fi for the first time. Like, they always treated their handheld entries as kind of, like, this is the next entry in the series, rather than, this is just the handheld version, this is the spin-off. And I think that kind of helped the DS feel a bit more, just, like, a legitimate, like, big deal compared to the PSP, which kind of felt like Sony was just kind of like, just like, it's a spin-off machine. Which I would say, overall, the DS would win for me, but in terms of what I'm more interested in now, it's definitely the PSP, just based on just how weird there's so much stuff on there, and it's genuinely still impressive. Like, when you play a console port on the PSP now, I'm not gonna play like this, but just playing it like a little bit, I'm like, this is incredibly impressive.
When they were threatening to shut down the PS3 store, one thing I did was I downloaded Metal Gear Solid from PS1 to my Vita, and that purchase was from 2008. I think it's just so cool that you can take something you purchased like a decade ago, almost like a decade and a half ago at this point, and just play it on a system that like that's a generation older. There was a lot of games like that. They had a cross-buy system. Like, if you bought PlayStation All-Stars on PS3, you would get it on Vita as well. Or if you bought like an indie game like Hotline Miami, you'd get both the PS3 and the Vita version. Whereas like on the Nintendo side, if you bought Super Mario Bros. On 3DS, you didn't have it on Wii U. You've got to buy it again.
It is so typical. Somebody that refuses to admit Mario vs. Donkey Kong tipping stars existed. I'm disgusted. I think I do agree though. Even stuff like Mighty Number 9 had cross-buy. It's just like random stuff like that. I think they were truly ahead of their time. We'll end on this. If we understand that the DS was definitely won for you. But if you could only have one console on a desert island, like one, it doesn't matter which one is like the more superior one from like a technical or library, software, whatever standpoint. If you could only have one console on a desert island and you have like all their games, what would you pick? Because I feel like mine is, I feel like this is a question that potentially could go a little differently.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you can load the PSP up with movies and like a bunch of UMDs, so that extends beyond games.
If you had a DS Lite,
the DS has GBA.
If you had a DS Lite, you have GBA and you have GBA video. So that debate is nullified.
Yeah, that's true.
What are you gonna watch on the PSP? I have Zathura. That's about it. Like, what? You're gonna watch that and compared to GBA video? Did those even release in Europe?
Yeah, we got some GBA video. I've got like a Fairly Odd Parents one, I think. Somewhere.
Okay, well that's fair. Okay,
I might have imported that though. I don't remember. I remember I got it on eBay at one point. But it's tough to say because I feel like a lot of the DS library, there's highlights. There's some really good ones, but there's also some which are very of their time. There's some which are like Brain Training. I don't know how much I'll play that today. But things like Dragon Quest 4, 5, and 6, I feel like they've aged really well. But there's just some which I don't think quite have. But I think the highlights of the library would carry it for me. and I'd probably spend more time. If I'd spend the rest of my life with one console, it probably would be the DS.
This is tricky for me because, as somebody that didn't grow up with the PSP, there's so much more that I haven't experienced. You have a lot of console quality ports there that I could also be like, hey, I can play Manhunt 2 on the on an island. And it's still a pretty decent version. And then on top of that, you do have a lot of extra stuff where you do have, Mega Man Powered Up. You do have Mega Man Powered Up, and I think I blanked there. That's not me being cheeky. I was just like.
If we're talking Japanese releases too, they got some enhanced PS1 games like Mega Man Legends. We got a physical release in Japan, and it's in widescreen.
I forgot about that.
It's in full 16:9.
Yeah,
and so's Suikoden. There's a Suikoden 1 and 2 compilation also in widescreen.
Well, the Dracula X Chronicles is really cool. The fact that they did that, Konami. Ghosts and Goblins, like we said. There's some very Nintendo-esque games in the fact that these were originally Nintendo franchises, even though, Castlevania Dracula X was...
Loco Roco would be a big... Like that, Nintendo fans would love Loco Roco. Very
much so. I played a little bit of Loco Roco. There's also the Patapon series. There's a lot of stuff that's just like, okay, alright. There's some good stuff on here. And you do get Grand Theft Auto games, which is just like, you can kill a lot of time if you're like, hey, like, even if you're just like, I don't know what to play, that's always a fun time to just jump in. But the DS had Chinatown Wars. The PSP also had Chinatown Wars, though. But it's better on DS, though, just from the control. I mean, like, there's a lot of stuff where that game was made for the DS.
Yeah, the touchscreen stuff.
Yeah, it's very tricky. Because, like I said, like, I would have more to just... Because the DS, I feel like, in some regards, even with games that it did well in, I feel like the DS visually doesn't age well for me personally in terms of, like, a lot of the sprite work on DS is not very appealing to me. It looks very... there's something, like, fuzzy about it. It's really odd.
There's DS text hasn't aged well.
Yeah.
A lot of fonts on the DS.
Yeah.
Are very
odd.
Like bold, funky fonts. Yeah. Talking about this with you though is interesting because you don't mention Pokemon, which is like the biggest DS franchise.
I got nothing to tell you about that. Yeah. Like that just it doesn't. I feel like a lot of Pokemon games. Like I look at like how a lot of the community responds to like what's the best one, and it's always different. It's always different. It's a bit more of like a more. It's just more of like a just. It's kind of like the Zelda, like in terms of like how people respond to Zelda games now, where everybody has their own favorites, and there's always kind of the punching bag for like that period of time, where we're still kind of in the Skyward Sword era, like kind of left with HD, but in terms of like that being like the one people go like, no, that was bad, but I do think I don't know, I feel like a lot of Pokemon games, like I feel like you get kind of like. No matter what, as long as it's like DS and GBA and onward, you're gonna get pretty much like a very similar experience with Pokemon across any Nintendo console that you get in terms of like, it's Pokemon, I'm cool with that. So that's not a big deal to me personally, and also because I just never grew up with Pokemon, and I feel like it's really hard to get into Pokemon if you don't have that kind of nostalgia value, because I'm playing Legends Arceus, and I can definitely see the value in it, but I'm still not, like, overwhelmed with, like, finally, I'm still, like, I need a little bit more, but I'll see. I'll definitely play more of it, but, yeah, so my Desert Island experience would probably not include Pokemon, though I wouldn't have much of an excuse if I had the entire library. I would probably at least try more of it, but I feel like I'd probably go with PSP, like you said. I know I shit on Zathura being my only UMD, but there's more. You have, what else you released on UMD?
There's a lot. Yeah. There's a bunch of regional stuff. Like there's a sitcom here called Little Britain, which is on UMD, and there's lots of like just local shows they released on that platform.
Do you think how hard do you think it was to go through Sony to get a UMD released of your show? If you had do you think it would have been that easy? Do you think they would have been really expensive to do? Or do you think they would have just welcomed it? They were like, please God, release something on UMD.
I think that's probably their attitude. Like, I don't know how many UMDs they release, but I know, like, just going to like any like charity shop, they're full of UMDs. And especially, I know Sony movies probably had the advantage. Like, if you go to any, like, thrift store, Spider-Man 2 on UMD is usually there. I think they probably gave the higher up to their own studios, but yeah, there's so many that you can find on there.
I love the fact that they did, at launch for the PSP, you had Spider-Man 2 on PSP and then Spider-Man 2 on UMD. I love that it was you have both Spider-Man 2s. Yeah. I love that. I don't know. I feel like, this is just from my perspective of like, I feel like I would just get more out of the PSP just based on how much I've played of the DS and how I just haven't experienced as much PSP. And I feel like there's just so much there that I'm like, I'm looking at the stack of games and I'm just like, okay, like, would I rather play Ratchet & Clank Size Matters or Mario 64 DS? And that's tricky because I love Mario 64 and I have a lot of nostalgia for the DS version. But it's not a version I want to play these days just based on the controls alone. And if I would have the DS, I would have the original DS. Where the circle pad makes things a little feel better, but I don't know.
It's cheating though, isn't it? It's still 8 directions.
Yeah, or it's just like, playing it on like the Wii U Virtual Console, you do get an analog stick. Everybody will say that. Like, whenever you bring that up to people, you're just like, I don't like Mario 64 DS, and they're just like, looks like somebody hasn't played it on the 3DS or the Wii U Virtual Console, and it's just like, what are you talking about? It doesn't make things that much better. It makes things a little better, but not that much at all.
No, it's the illusion of being better.
Yeah, you know what? I'll go with the PSP just so then we have something to disagree on, okay. And also because I feel like there's a lot of untapped. It's an untapped well for me with a lot of PSP, where I feel like I could get a lot out of that experience. So overall, I understand why the DS won, but I think the PSP is a little more interesting these days, just because everybody knows the DS, and I feel like people just don't give the PSP as much attention as it really deserves.
Yeah. I guess you just have to get in contact with Sony now and get Borderline Forever printed on UMD.
That's, you know what?
That's the goal.
Watch out, America. It's coming.